On August 23, 1305, the streets of London echoed with screams unlike anything witnesses had ever heard. William Wallace, Scotland's greatest hero, was being systematically torn apart while fully conscious, his organs cut out and burned before his eyes as thousands cheered for more blood. Because what really happened to William Wallace was so much worse than any Hollywood movie dared to show. A calculated torture designed to destroy not just a man, but the very idea of Scottish freedom. London, August 1305. The city had been preparing for this spectacle for days, transforming William Wallace's execution into the ultimate public entertainment. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, hadn't just ordered an execution. He had designed a masterpiece of cruelty that would serve as the ultimate warning to anyone who dared defy English rule. The charges against Wallace were carefully crafted to justify the horror to come: treason, murder, sacrilege, and rebellion against the English crown. The irony wasn't lost on those who understood. Wallace was being executed for treason against a king he had never acknowledged as his sovereign. "I cannot be guilty of treason," Wallace reportedly declared during his sham trial at Westminster Hall, "because I was never Edward's subject." This defiant response sealed his fate, though in truth, the outcome had been predetermined from the moment of his capture. The sentence was pronounced with ceremonial gravity. Wallace was to be hanged by the neck, but not until dead, then disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and his body cut into 4 parts. Each element carried symbolic meaning. The hanging represented his rejection by heaven, the disemboweling his spiritual corruption, and the quartering his complete annihilation. But Edward's true genius lay in making Wallace's agony as public and prolonged as possible. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about theater, entertainment, and the systematic destruction of hope itself. The morning of August 23rd dawned clear and warm. Vendors hawked food and drink to the gathering crowds, turning Wallace's final moments into a festival of death. The authorities had deliberately created a carnival atmosphere, encouraging the bloodthirsty enthusiasm that would make Wallace's suffering even more psychologically devastating. Wallace was first stripped naked and bound to a wooden hurdle, then dragged through London's busiest streets behind horses. The rough cobblestones tore at his flesh, leaving a trail of blood that marked his final journey, while crowds jeered and threw refuse at the man who had once terrified English armies. At Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground, a specially constructed scaffold awaited. The crowd here was massive and boisterous, with the best viewing positions claimed hours earlier by spectators who had paid premium prices to witness history's most notorious execution. The executioner, a skilled professional who had likely performed dozens of such killings, began his work with practiced efficiency. Wallace was first hanged by the neck, but the rope was carefully positioned to ensure strangulation rather than a quick death by breaking the neck. The crowd watched with savage delight as Wallace struggled for breath, his face turning purple, his body convulsing in the universal dance of death by asphyxiation. But just as consciousness began to fade, he was cut down, still alive, still aware of the unimaginable horror that was about to unfold. "The crowd's roar was deafening," wrote one contemporary observer. "They screamed for blood, as if watching the greatest entertainment of their lives." What followed was the most horrific part of the entire ordeal. While Wallace was still fully conscious, the executioner began the process of disemboweling him. Using a razor-sharp knife, he cut open the abdomen and began removing the internal organs one by one. Contemporary accounts describe Wallace's screams as unlike anything witnesses had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of human suffering itself. The executioner held up each organ for the crowd to see before throwing it into a fire that had been prepared specifically for this purpose. The symbolism was deliberate and devastating. In medieval thought, the bowels were considered the seat of emotion and compassion. By burning them while Wallace watched, the executioner was symbolically destroying his humanity, reducing him to something less than human in the eyes of the crowd. The smell of burning flesh and organs filled the air, adding another layer of horror to an already nightmarish scene. Through all of this, Wallace remained conscious, his eyes open and aware, even as his body was systematically destroyed. Some accounts suggest he continued to speak, though his words have been lost to history. The executioner's skill lay not just in causing maximum pain, but in keeping the victim alive as long as possible. Death would come as a release, not as the culmination of suffering. The crowd's bloodlust reached fever pitch as Wallace's torment continued. These weren't monsters watching, but ordinary English citizens who had been conditioned to view this systematic destruction as entertainment. The normalization of extreme cruelty revealed something deeply disturbing about human nature when given official sanction. The executioner continued his grisly work with professional detachment, removing Wallace's heart, liver, and other vital organs, while ensuring he remained conscious to witness his own destruction. Each organ was displayed to the crowd like a trophy before being cast into the flames. His suffering seemed to last forever, recorded a Scottish observer who had somehow gained access to witness the execution. Yet through it all, he never begged for mercy or renounced his cause. This detail would become crucial to Wallace's legend. Even as his body was being destroyed piece by piece, witnesses noted that he maintained his dignity, refusing to give Edward I the satisfaction of seeing him broken. His eyes, though filled with agony, never lost their defiance. The psychological impact on the crowd was complex. While many cheered the spectacle, others began to feel uncomfortable as the torture continued. Some witnesses reported nightmares for years afterward, haunted by the sounds and sights of that August morning. The executioner's skill was both remarkable and horrifying. He managed to keep Wallace alive and conscious throughout the disemboweling, a feat that required precise knowledge of human anatomy and the mechanics of death. This was torture elevated to an art form, cruelty perfected through professional expertise. The fire that consumed Wallace's organs created a column of greasy black smoke that could be seen across London. The smell, described by witnesses as sweet and sickening, lingered in the air for hours, a physical reminder of the horror that had transpired. Through it all, Wallace's eyes remained fixed on some distant point, as if seeing beyond the immediate horror to something greater. Whether this was defiance, resignation, or simply shock, it became part of his legend, the man who stared down death itself. Finally, mercifully, the executioner moved to complete his work. The heart was the last organ removed, and with it, Wallace's life finally ebbed away. But even in death, his humiliation was not complete. Wallace's head was severed with a single stroke of a sharp axe, finally ending his suffering. But the executioner's work was far from finished. The head was held aloft for the crowd to see, blood still dripping from the severed neck, before being set aside for preservation and display. The body was then cut into 4 quarters, each piece held up for the crowd's inspection like cuts of meat in a butcher's shop. The systematic reduction of Scotland's greatest hero to literal pieces represented the complete triumph of English power over Scottish resistance. But Edward I's plan went even further. The disposal of Wallace's remains was as calculated as his execution. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it and mounted on a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain for years as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging English authority. The 4 quarters of his body were sent to different cities: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they were displayed publicly as reminders of English power. This distribution wasn't random. Each location had strategic importance in the ongoing English occupation of Scotland. "Let all who see these remains remember the fate of traitors," proclaimed the royal decree accompanying each shipment. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who defy English rule. The immediate reaction in Scotland was exactly what Edward had hoped for. Many nobles who had supported Wallace either fled the country or submitted to English rule, calculating that no cause was worth such a horrific death. The execution had successfully transformed a symbol of resistance into a warning against rebellion, but Edward had fundamentally misunderstood the Scottish character. Rather than crushing resistance, the brutality of Wallace's execution actually strengthened it. The very horror of his death became a rallying cry for those who refused to accept English domination. Robert the Bruce, who would later become King of Scotland, was reportedly moved to action by Wallace's martyrdom. The execution had revealed the true face of English rule, a regime that would stop at nothing to maintain its dominance. The manner of Wallace's death also influenced future Scottish tactics. The lesson was clear: capture by the English meant torture beyond imagination. This knowledge led to a more desperate and determined form of warfare, where Scottish fighters preferred death in battle to surrender. The news of Wallace's execution spread across Europe like wildfire, contributing to England's reputation as a power willing to use extreme measures to maintain control. Foreign diplomats reported the details with a mixture of horror and fascination, understanding that this was how Edward I dealt with those who opposed him. In Scotland, the reaction was swift and decisive. Rather than intimidating the population into submission, Wallace's martyrdom inspired a new generation of resistance fighters who saw, in his death proof, that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. Wallace's execution created a collective trauma that became part of Scottish cultural identity, a shared memory of suffering that united the nation in ways that military victory alone could never have achieved. Contemporary accounts revealed the complex emotions the execution generated. English observers noted with satisfaction that Scottish resistance seemed to crumble in the immediate aftermath. But Scottish sources tell a different story, of a people galvanized by the horror of what they had witnessed. The execution also demonstrated the limitations of terror as a political tool. While it successfully intimidated some, it also created martyrs whose memory proved more powerful than their living presence. Edward I had intended to end Scottish resistance. Instead, he had given it its most potent symbol. The cultural impact extended beyond immediate politics. Wallace's story began to spread through ballads and folk tales, each retelling emphasizing his courage in the face of unimaginable suffering. The execution that was meant to destroy his legend instead ensured its immortality. Legal scholars would later point to Wallace's treatment as an example of judicial excess that violated fundamental principles of human dignity. The concept that even enemies of the state deserved basic human treatment began to emerge, partly as a reaction to such extremes. The executioner himself reportedly struggled with nightmares after the event. Professional though he was, the prolonged nature of Wallace's suffering had affected even this hardened specialist in death. Several witnesses suffered similar psychological trauma, haunted by the sounds and sights they had witnessed. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the concept of martyrdom itself. Wallace's death redefined what it meant to die for a cause, establishing a template of dignified suffering that would inspire freedom fighters for centuries to come. The legacy of William Wallace's execution extends far beyond the immediate horror of that August day in 1305. What Edward I intended as the ultimate demonstration of English power became instead the founding myth of Scottish independence, proof that some principles are worth any suffering. In the years that followed, Wallace's story grew beyond historical fact into something approaching legend. Each retelling emphasized not the brutality of his death, but the dignity with which he faced it. The man who had refused to beg for mercy became a symbol of the unbreakable human spirit. The execution also revealed fundamental truths about the nature of tyranny and resistance. Edward I's elaborate cruelty demonstrated that oppressive power always contains the seeds of its own destruction. The very excess of Wallace's punishment guaranteed that it would be remembered and resented for generations. Robert the Bruce's subsequent victories against English forces were fought in Wallace's name, with Scottish warriors drawing strength from the memory of their martyred hero. The execution that was meant to end Scottish resistance had instead provided it with an inexhaustible source of inspiration. The international impact was equally significant. Other European kingdoms watched the Wallace execution with horror, seeing in it the true face of English imperialism. The brutality damaged England's reputation across the continent, contributing to the diplomatic isolation that would complicate English foreign policy for decades. Modern forensic analysis of contemporary accounts suggests that Wallace remained conscious for most of his ordeal, a testament both to the executioner's skill and to human endurance in the face of unimaginable suffering. His ability to maintain dignity under such circumstances transformed a military defeat into a moral victory. The disposal of Wallace's remains, head on London Bridge, quarters scattered across Scotland, was intended to spread the message of English dominance. Instead, it created multiple shrines where Scottish patriots could come to remember their hero and renew their commitment to freedom. Perhaps most remarkably, the execution failed in its primary purpose. Far from crushing Scottish resistance, it provided the movement with its most powerful recruiting tool. Wallace's death proved that liberty was worth any price, and that the human spirit could triumph even in defeat. The blood-soaked cobblestones of medieval London continue to echo with Wallace's message that freedom is never free, that some causes transcend personal survival, and that true victory is sometimes achieved not through conquest but through the willingness to suffer for principle. Today, As we face our own struggles between freedom and oppression, Wallace's story remains painfully relevant. His execution reminds us that liberty is always under threat, and that each generation must decide anew what price they are willing to pay to preserve it.